معنا الأستاذ كريستوف راوخ، وهو مدير المجموعة الشرقية بمكتبة برلين الحكومية، حاصل على ماجستير الدراسات العربية والإسلامية والدين من جامعة لايبزيغ، ويعمل منذ عام 2004 مديراً لقسم المخطوطات الشرقية في مكتبة برلين الحكومية، ويشتغل حالياً ضمن مشروع بحثي ممول من المؤسسات الألمانية للأبحاث DFG لإنشاء فهرس موحد للمخطوطات الشرقية في المجموعات الألمانية. وسوف يتحدث أيضاً عن يوهان فيستشتاين وجهوده في جمع المخطوطات العربية. تفضل أستاذ كريستوف راوخ.
شكرا جزيلا لماركس جمعة الماجد ولعزيز أحمد لدعوتكم إلى هذا المؤتمر. أنا آسف لأن أتذع عن تحدث الآن باللغة الإنجليزية، لكن أنا أعتقد هذا أحسن لكلنا.
هي للأسف المترجمة حصل لها ظرف صحي فاعتذرت لذلك، ولكن لا بأس. Mr. Christoph, you can go in English.
شكرا. The State Library in Berlin, the Staatsbibliothek zu Berlin, holds an important collection of Oriental manuscripts, and among the 11,000 objects in Arabic language, a significant proportion were acquired during the second half of the 19th century. It is well known that Berlin's manuscript holdings were significantly shaped by the acquisitions of the collections of scholars like Johann Gottfried Wetzstein, Johann Heinrich Petermann, Alois Sprenger, and others. These predominantly Arabic collection alone comprise more than 7,400 manuscripts. So the Wetzstein collection is a focus of attention today. Wetzstein from Saxony in Germany studied Arabic in Leipzig with the famous Heinrich Lebrecht Fleischer, and later taught at the university in Berlin. He became the first Prussian consul to Damascus and lived there from 1849 to 1862. He had an excellent ethnographic knowledge of Syria and of classical and colloquial Syrian Arabic, and published several important works on this. But first of all, he contributed to the study of Islam in Europe by selling several extensive manuscript collections to the libraries in Leipzig, Berlin, and Tübingen, as already was stated. The collections in Berlin are the most extensive, with about 2,200 volumes from Wetzstein. It is diverse in its nature and documents various branches of Islamic culture and Arabic literature. Among the valuable sources are hundreds of volumes of popular epics, for example, Sira Sha'abiyya, that are currently part of a digitization project in our library. Wetzstein was reading that literature during the evenings, he stated in one of the letters, sometimes accompanied by a Hekawati, a storyteller. So Wetzstein was not only dealing with manuscripts, he studied many of them as well. So there's much to say about his scholarly and commercial activities in Damascus. I would like to focus on just two aspects today. How did Wetzstein initiate the acquisition of ancient Quranic fragments in Damascus? And what does the example of Wetzstein's activities and sale negotiations tell us about the manuscript trade in Europe about around 1860? When Wetzstein came to Berlin for the first time on home leave in 1851, he already brought with him a manuscript collection of 200 volumes, or more than 200 volumes. Wetzstein convinced the Prussian government of the value of these books and stated that Damascus was probably the last place where old and important manuscripts could be found. As a speaker before, Farid, he already explained very well all this report of Wetzstein, what he brought to Berlin, and the description of the manuscript trade in Damascus. So Wetzstein's description of the situation on the Arab book market during his visit home in 1851 had left a lasting impression in Berlin. Probably also as an after effect of this, the Berlin professor Julius Heinrich Petermann was released for a trip to the Middle East. His declared aim was to acquire antiquities and manuscripts for the library and museums in Berlin. He accompanied Wetzstein on his return journey to Damascus in 1852 in the next year. Petermann was particularly interested in Christian texts, but they were hard to find It was finally while searching for ancient biblical texts in Damascus that Wetzstein and Petermann learned of a significant repository of ancient Quranic fragments in the Damascus Umayyad Mosque. Petermann reported the acquisition of 3 Kufic Quran manuscripts on parchment to the library director in Berlin as early as 2nd November of 1852. And he wrote to the director, Dr. Wetzstein asked one of the most respected men in the city to look in the famous mosque of the Umayyads to see if any Christian manuscripts were still to be found there. He did so, but with the assurance that he had found nothing of the kind. He brought the 2 Quran manuscripts with him and said that apart from these, there were only loose leaves and 3 mighty large codices of the Quran copied for the Caliphs Omar, Abu Bakr, and Osman. And the Berlin head librarian Heinrich Pertz was enthusiastic about this purchase and the prospect of further finds and urged Petermann to pursue this lead without fail. I only ask you, answered Pertz to Damascus, to Petermann, I only ask you to buy all loose sheets, however many there may be, which are in the Umayyad Mosque, and to send them over with you. It is precisely in such loose leaves that the strangest discoveries can sometimes be made. But Petermann did not succeed at first because he traveled further to Baghdad and later returned to Berlin. But Wetzstein's contact person, Petermann reported, had arranged for another Kufic manuscript that stood out because it was vocalized in red, which was previously unknown. It is therefore likely that the manuscript with the shelf mark MS or Quad 372 also comes from this source and was sold by Petermann. Here you see examples of the first Qurans that entered the library via Petermann in 1853. We don't know who was this contact person who was mentioned by Petermann in the letter, who brought the material to the Umayyad Mosque. Maybe that this is only an assumption. It was Mahmud Hamza, the head of the Waqf of the Awqaf in Damascus and was later the Mufti in Damascus. Wetzstein mentions him as one of his friends, and he was an influential person in Damascus, of course. Petermann and Wetzstein were almost certainly the first to gain access to these materials. Charles Schaeffer's collection, now in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France, also contains fragments that he had acquired around the same time in Damascus, but the exact circumstances cannot be reconstructed. Over the years, Wetzstein had finally succeeded in acquiring manuscripts of Kufic Qur'ans fragments on a considerable scale from the Umayyad Mosque's collection. It is possible that the big Quran with the shelf mark Wetzstein II 1913, already presented by Ahmed before, is one of the large manuscripts from the time of the early caliphs mentioned in Petermann's letter. Wetzstein was able to place his extensive second collection of almost 2,000 volumes in the Royal Library in Berlin as early as 1859 without any decision having been made about a sale to the library. Possibly the driving force here, or at least a beneficiary, was Theodor Nöldeke, the Orientalist who worked as an assistant in the Royal Library in Berlin from 1858 to 1860. Well, this is the picture here is when Nöldeke already was an old man. I did not find an image from the time when Theodor Nöldeke worked in the library as a young man. But he worked there from 1858 to 1860. And here Nöldeke had the opportunity to see the fragments of the Quran before his landmark publication, The History of the Quran, went to press in 1860. Perhaps Nöldeke's interest also inspired Wetzstein to acquire further fragments of the Quran, which then reached Tübingen as part of the fourth Wetzstein collection in 1864. Despite the interest of many scholars for the second Wetzstein collection that was already deposited in Berlin, and that included such exciting new material like the more than 900 Quran parchment folios, it was not easy for Wetzstein to find a buyer for the collection. And Wetzstein was in a strained financial situation all the time. As honorary consul in Damascus, he received no fixed salary, only reimbursement of expenses and official costs. His expenses, which he had to incur for representative purposes, for example, in order to give his consulate the necessary prestige, exceeded his income. As early as March 1851 and several times in the following years, Wetzstein sought permission to leave Damascus back to Prussia. The high expenses were a major reason for his applications for resignation, which were all rejected. Wetzstein was thus dependent on additional income. He invested in agricultural projects, but the situation still remained difficult for him. Since he was able to invest his money, or it was the money of his wife, at 24% interest at the time, he was dependent on the largest possible profit margin for his manuscript collection as well, because several years passed between the investment in manuscripts and the sale to a European library. The sale of manuscripts in Europe with profit was a risky venture for someone without financial reserves. He had no guarantee that a library would buy. That is probably also the reason that he tried to dissuade the Berlin Library from buying other collections. The Berlin Library was desperate to acquire the collection of Colonel Robert Tyler, the recently deceased English envoy in Cairo and Baghdad. Wetzstein was consulted as an external expert. He said that Taylor had paid exorbitant collector's prices when he assembled his collection, that manuscripts were now available at much lower prices than in the past, and that the printing of books also led to a lower demand for manuscripts. Assertions that were completely at odds with the arguments Wetzstein used to promote his own collection. The librarians in Berlin were incensed by Wetzstein's report to the ministry, as it dashed their hopes of receiving funding for the Taylor collection. After this episode I briefly mentioned, and with the Alois Sprenger collection acquired for much money in 1857, in the same year, when the Taylor collection was offered, one might think Wetzstein's prospects of finding supporters at the Berlin Library for another purchase were not favorable. In 1859, as already mentioned, Wetzstein offered his large second collection to the Royal Library. Before that, he had already investigated in another direction and was in contact with Walter Bernauer, Orientalist and librarian at the Vienna Court Library. Bernauer regretfully saw no possibility of funding. Wetzstein then tried to advertise his collection in America. Some daily newspapers there reported on the offer. The American missionary Edward Robinson, whom Wetzstein knew from Damascus, and the librarian of the New York Astor Library helped him to promote his collections there. But he received the reply that a sale in America would be difficult and negotiations lengthy because the universities there did not offer sufficient finances. But Wetzstein was in need of money. When the second Wetzstein collection arrived in Berlin, the lawyer of the Orientalist Alois Sprenger demanded the right of disposition over the collection or the seizure of part of it, since Sprenger had cancelled a loan to Wetzstein. From 1861 onwards, the lawyer of Sprenger threatened to auction off the collection if the Berlin Library did not complete the purchase quickly. Wetzstein demanded 34,000 thaler for his collection in Berlin and an interest rate of 4.5% if the sum was paid in installments. He believed that the collection had a much higher value, but that he could not make higher demands due to the current political and economic situation in Europe. When the decision to buy was finally made in 1862 by the officials in Berlin, Wetzstein accepted the considerably reduced sum of 25,000 thaler to be paid in 3 installments without any interest. He also had to accept losses for the Tübingen collection in 1864. He received there 20% less than he had asked for. I come to the conclusion, and the transfer of manuscript to the libraries of Europe and to other areas of the Ottoman Empire undoubtedly meant a deep cut for Syria's cultural heritage. It was caused by a growing economic disparity, for example, between the emerging Prussia and the crisis-ridden provinces of the Ottoman Empire. It is not the intention of my contribution to relativize this loss. However, for a factual view of the events, it is necessary to consider the various scientific, political, and economic sub-aspects in their interplay. Wetzstein, on the one hand, was able to exploit the advantage that his position as a diplomat and his reputation as a scholar in Syria offered him to get access to material like the fragments of the Kubbat al-Khasna. On the other hand, he was obviously not a successful business person. Time, money, and risk he invested in dealing with manuscripts is not proportional to the profit he finally made for himself. Local prices rose with demand, and libraries in Europe did not have limitless resources. This only changed again with the entry of American universities into the competition of collections at the end of the 19th century. Wetzstein realized that the educated Arabs were reluctant to sell manuscripts, and he reported that the sellout of their own tradition was perceived as a bitter loss by the local educated elite. Despite his empathy and sympathy that Wetzstein felt with his Arabic friends, he was a manuscript hunter who wanted to make Arabic knowledge and heritage accessible to European scholars in libraries in Prussia. I close here, and at the end, I only want to mention that there is a third small convolute of Qur'ans related to Wetzstein, a small convolute that he kept in his private library and that was sold to the Berlin Library after his death in the year 1917. And many of our manuscripts that I showed here are digitized, and about a third of the Arabic collection is already digitized, and you can download and the image, and you can browse in the online catalog and our digital collections. If you go to the page www.calamos.net, you will find more information how to find access to metadata and images of our manuscript. Thank you very much.